How many of you have been following this whole George Santos story? Yeah. For those of you who have not been, he's this guy that ran for Congress from Long Island, claiming that, telling his personal story of growing up Jewish and going to Baruch College and then NYU and working at Goldman Sachs and then owning some real estate around Long Island and in New York City. And then he was elected to Congress, right? And then it turns out that he didn't actually go to Baruch College or NYU, and he never worked for Goldman Sachs, and he didn't actually own any real estate. And as for being Jewish, he said, actually, what I meant was I was Jewish. And so I am actually Jewish, and I will concede that I have described myself as Jewish on quite a few occasions, especially when it comes to buying pepperoni and sausage pizzas. But I've been thinking about the George Santos story a lot lately and how we all kind of maybe make up some things about ourselves. I remember when I was in college and we took a trip to England, actually. It was a college trip to England, and I had a mildly flirtatious conversation with a woman at a radio station, actually, and it was very mildly flirtatious, let me tell you. Very mildly. And by the time I got back on the bus with the other college students, it was much more than mildly flirtatious. So, yeah, I think we all make up some things, and of course, then I work for Goldman Sachs. But mostly, I think about the George Santos story through the lens of my 8th grade teacher, Mr. McDowell. And he was our science teacher, and this was back in the days. This is 1982, I think. It was probably life science or earth science, but it was just called science in those days. And it was a terrific class. I think back, if you look back far enough in the archives of my photos, which are in a big cardboard box in my dining room, there is a picture of Mr. McDowell dumping me in a trash can. And it was fairly easy in those days. I was actually even smaller than this and lighter weight. And you would think that this is a horrible memory, especially, we talk about in gym class and, but this is actually one of the happiest memories I have. I find that picture every once in a while, and it's in black and white. And this is a great picture of me because Mr. McDowell was that good a teacher. He taught us about rocks, and he taught us how to dissect frogs. He was the first teacher I had who could actually quote Doonesbury lines right back at me. And, I was the 8th grader that was spewing Doonesbury, and he called me. He actually corrected me a couple times, so he was that cool. And he was also the advisor to the Outdoor Pursuits Club, which was the club in 8th grade that everybody wanted to join. It was, when you got to what we called intermediate school in those days, you wanted to be part of the Outdoor Pursuits Club. He took us on a bunch of trips that these days probably would require like a 100-page long waiver form. But in those days, hey, why not? We'll take you on a 26-mile hiking trip down the C&O Canal. We'll go winter camping and rappelling in West Virginia. This was the time when it was the first time I had gone rappelling, and I spent probably 20 minutes on the edge of the cliff, and Mr. McDowell from the bottom of the cliff calls out, "Hey, Mitch, are you so scared you could hear a gnat fart?" And actually, it turns out I was. We did that. He took us to the Chesapeake Bay, where we stayed for a weekend on this tiny little island. It was a science station in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, and we learned about water quality, and we learned about erosion. It was really cool. He was a cool guy, too. He told us about his time as a combat medic in the Marines in Vietnam. He showed us his scars. He had bullet scars up and down his leg. He was in underwater demolitions for Shell Oil, which is how he knew so much about water quality. So it was really like that memorable a time in school, especially, this was 8th grade. This was a tough time in general. 8th grade is not necessarily a happy memory for most of us, but Outdoor Pursuits Club and science class was this kind of island of like stuff that you looked forward to every day or every week or when you went rappelling. And so we all had this memory. This was the 80s, and we have our yearbooks to look back at. And so it was well before the age of the internet. And so when Google finally came along, like 15 or 20 years later, I decided I needed to look up Mr. McDowell because I wanted to get in touch with him and tell him how much his class had meant to me, and that I had become a journalist and I had given up rappelling. And so I looked him up and, typed in his name and some keywords, and this disconnect happened. Like the results that came up were definitely the right guy, but not what I expected to find. What I found were listings for his name among a whole bunch of people who were known to have faked their heroism in the military. And it was hard to reconcile. And you looked a little further and found out that he had become an assistant principal at a school and had lost his job because he had faked his he had not actually received the doctorate he claimed to have received. And it was just, every time I would talk to people, I don't know that many people still from my 8th grade class, but people say, hey, have you heard about Mr. McDowell? And they had all done the same Google search and found the same unbelievable news. And so, I think about it, and someone who fakes heroism, who claims to have done heroic things that he never did, is not a hero. And at the same time, I think about one day in class in 8th grade, and to this day, I don't know why Mr. McDowell decided to show us a movie that day, but he did. And the movie he showed us was Harvest of Shame, which was an Edward R. Murrow documentary from the 60s about the abysmal living conditions that migrant farm workers went through. And that is the day that I knew I would be a journalist. And I think about the guy that showed me the film that changed my career, it launched my career, and the guy that taught us about water quality and about respect for the environment, and then the guy who one day, having received what I am sure were real physical scars during his time in Vietnam, started changing his story to reflect some other scars. And I think, is this guy a hero? Is this guy a villain? And frankly, I don't know the answer. Thank you.